that this is, a man that is in his 70s, that is having this ongoing treatment for cancer. It's a reminder of how hard it is and actually how hard he has been working. Perhaps this is a reminder that he needs to take it easy every so often.
Just minutes ago, Prince William stepped forward and revealed the devastating truth the palace has been hiding for months. King Charles's health has taken a turn no one saw coming, and what William just confirmed has left the entire nation in shock. A secret letter, a midnight decision, and one heartbreaking moment that changed everything.
I want to say a few words about my father and why I believe this weekend is so important. But don't worry, unlike Lionel, I won't go on all night long.
The crown is no longer where you think it is. What's unfolding right now at Sandringham will rewrite royal history forever, and by the end of this video, you'll discover the one detail they never wanted you to know. This is not the first time the palace has issued health updates about the king. Since his diagnosis was made public earlier this year, there have been regular statements reassuring the public that treatment was progressing and that His Majesty remained committed to his duties. But today's announcement feels different. The language used, the timing, and the location all point to something more significant than a routine medical update. Sources close to the royal household have indicated that senior members of the family have been called to Sandringham, and that the king's private schedule has been cleared indefinitely. What makes this moment particularly poignant is the setting. Sandringham has always been more than just a royal residence. It is a private refuge, a place where the royal family has gathered for generations during times of both celebration and crisis. It was here that Queen Elizabeth II spent her final days, and it was here that the family retreated after the death of Prince Philip. The estate holds deep emotional significance, and the fact that King Charles has chosen to remain here during this period speaks volumes about the gravity of the situation. Inside the estate, according to reports from royal correspondents, the atmosphere is one of quiet concern. The king's personal study, which is normally filled with correspondence, briefing papers, and his beloved collection of fountain pens, has been largely cleared. His daily diary, once packed with engagements ranging from charity visits to meetings with government officials, now sits open on his desk with very few entries. One source described the last written note in the diary as simply reading, "The burden continues," a phrase that captures both the weight of monarchy and the personal struggle Charles has faced since ascending to the throne. The king's health journey has been a closely guarded matter, but what we do know paints a picture of a man who has continued to serve even as his body has been fighting a serious illness. Earlier this year, the palace confirmed that Charles had been diagnosed with cancer, though the specific type was not disclosed. Since then, he has undergone treatment while still fulfilling many of his royal duties, appearing at key events and maintaining a visible presence whenever possible. However, in recent weeks, those appearances have become less frequent. Engagements have been postponed, and public outings have been reduced to only the most essential occasions. Behind the scenes, there has been significant activity that suggests the royal household has been preparing for various outcomes. Senior aides have been working closely with constitutional experts, and there have been discreet meetings involving key members of the royal family. Among those most involved in these discussions are Princess Anne, known for her unwavering dedication and deep understanding of royal protocol, and Prince William, who has increasingly taken on more responsibilities over the past several months. One detail that has emerged, though not officially confirmed by the palace, is that King Charles recently signed a sealed document outlining his wishes in the event that he becomes unable to carry out his duties. This document, reportedly handwritten by the king himself, is said to be stored securely at Sandringham and has been seen by only a small circle of trusted individuals. Among them are believed to be Princess Anne, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Prince William. The existence of such a document is not unprecedented in royal history, but its creation at this particular moment underscores the seriousness of the king's condition. The phrase that has been circulating among those close to the palace is that this document changes everything. While the exact contents remain confidential, it is understood to provide clear guidance on how the transition of royal responsibilities should be handled if Charles is no longer able to fulfill his role as monarch. This is not about succession in the traditional sense, as that is already clearly established through centuries of constitutional practice. Rather, it appears to address the more complex scenario of a living monarch who may no longer be able to perform the duties of the crown. As night falls over Sandringham and the rain continues to fall on the surrounding countryside, Britain finds itself in a moment of collective uncertainty. The question on everyone's mind is simple yet profound. What happens next? Is this the beginning of a new chapter in the history of the British monarchy, or will the king recover and return to his duties? For now, all we can do is wait for further updates from the palace and hope for the best possible outcome for King Charles and his family. To truly understand the gravity of what is unfolding at Sandringham right now, we need to look back several months to when the first signs of trouble began to appear. It started quietly, as these situations often do, with small changes that most people outside the palace walls would never have noticed. King Charles, who had always been known for maintaining an incredibly disciplined daily routine, began to scale back his schedule in ways that seemed unusual for someone so committed to royal duty. Charles has never been someone who shied away from work. Even before becoming king, he was known for his relentless pace, often working late into the night on correspondence and waking early to begin another full day of engagements. His red boxes, the official government documents that require the monarch's attention, were always reviewed promptly, and his calendar was typically packed months in advance. But earlier this year, palace staff began to notice that his schedule was thinning out. Events were being spaced further apart, and more time was being allocated for what were described as private rest periods. At first, this was publicly explained as a sensible adjustment. After all, Charles had become king at the age of 73, older than any previous British monarch at the time of their accession. He had spent decades as heir apparent, waiting longer than anyone in history to take the throne. It seemed reasonable that his reign might look different from that of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, who had become queen at just 25 and was known for her extraordinary stamina and dedication over 7 decades. Palace officials suggested that the king was simply pacing himself appropriately for someone taking on such demanding responsibilities later in life. However, behind the carefully worded public statements, something more serious was taking place. Medical advisors to the king had been raising concerns for some time. Charles had been undergoing treatment that was described to the public as routine health maintenance, but the reality was far more complex. He had been participating in a targeted treatment program designed to address a rare form of illness that required regular medical intervention. The specific details were kept confidential, but it involved trips to Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge, a facility renowned for its advanced medical care and research capabilities. These visits were conducted with extraordinary discretion. The king would often be flown by helicopter in the early morning hours, arriving at the hospital before most staff had begun their day. What the public saw as peaceful countryside retreats to Sandringham or other royal residences were often actually periods of recovery following medical procedures. The level of secrecy surrounding these trips was remarkable, even by royal standards, and it required careful coordination between the palace, medical staff, and security personnel. Within the royal family, Queen Camilla became the primary gatekeeper during this period. Her public image remained one of steady support, always appearing alongside Charles when he did make public appearances, smiling and engaging with crowds as expected. But privately, she had taken on a much more protective role. According to those familiar with the situation, Camilla controlled access to the king with remarkable vigilance. She determined who could see him, when meetings could take place, and how much time visitors were allowed. Even Prince William, the heir to the throne, found that his access to his father was being carefully managed through Camilla. As the king's health situation continued, Prince William began to take on more visible responsibilities. This transition happened gradually enough that many people did not immediately recognize its significance. William started leading state visits that would typically have been handled by the reigning monarch. He attended more public functions, often representing his father at events that Charles would normally have prioritized. He also began holding private meetings with the Prime Minister, discussions that went beyond the usual briefings given to the heir apparent. One particularly notable appearance was at the Commonwealth Leadership Forum, an event that holds significant importance for the monarchy given its role as head of the Commonwealth. Traditionally, this would be attended by the reigning monarch, but William stepped in to lead Britain's delegation. The palace described this as a shared responsibility between father and son, but to those who understand royal protocol, it was a clear signal that William was not simply standing in for his father temporarily. He was beginning to assume a more permanent, expanded role. During this time, Princess Anne emerged as a crucial figure behind the scenes. Anne has always been known for her discretion and her deep loyalty to the institution of the monarchy. She carries out more royal engagements than almost any other member of the family, and she does so with minimal fuss or media attention. In the late summer, Anne made a significant private visit to Windsor Castle, specifically to access the late Queen Elizabeth's personal archive. This collection, housed in a secure area of the castle, contains private papers and correspondence that are rarely viewed by anyone. What Anne retrieved from this archive was a letter believed to have been written by Queen Elizabeth shortly before her death. The contents of this letter have not been made public, but sources suggest it contained guidance for the family on how to handle difficult transitions and decisions regarding the monarchy's future. One line from the letter, reportedly underlined in the Queen's own handwriting, read something to the effect of letting clarity protect the crown when duty and health come into conflict. This phrase would prove to be remarkably relevant to the situation now facing King Charles. Anne personally delivered this letter to her brother in early September. The meeting between the two siblings was private, with no staff present, but afterward, those close to Charles noticed a marked change in his demeanor. He became quieter and more contemplative. He spent less time on routine matters and more time in reflection. Staff observed him standing at the tall windows of Sandringham's north wing, the same room where Queen Elizabeth had worked during visits to the estate, simply looking out over the grounds. It was as if he was preparing himself for something that he knew was coming but had hoped to avoid. The first clear public indication that something was seriously wrong came not through an official palace announcement, but through a brief moment captured on camera during a charity reception in early September. King Charles, who had always been known for his graceful public presence and genuine warmth when meeting people, appeared visibly different that evening. As he greeted an ambassador from Ghana, he stumbled slightly, and his usual animated expression seemed absent. His face looked drawn, and those standing close enough noticed that his voice was softer and less steady than usual. Royal commentators who reviewed the footage largely dismissed it as simple fatigue. After all, the king had been maintaining a busy schedule despite his ongoing health challenges, and it would be natural for anyone in his position to show signs of exhaustion from time to time. But the aides who were present that evening, standing just out of camera view, knew the truth was far more concerning. The king had barely slept in the previous 3 days, and his medical team had been monitoring him closely for signs of deterioration. Just a week after that reception, unusual activity was observed at Sandringham during what was supposed to be a quiet private weekend. Local residents and staff noticed palace vehicles arriving late at night, well past the time when such movements would normally occur. Among the vehicles was a medical transport van with no identifying markings, followed closely by the car typically reserved for the royal physician. Despite the obvious significance of this late-night arrival, the official line from the palace remained unchanged. The king is resting and recuperating at Sandringham. Nothing to see here, they seemed to be saying, even as the truth was becoming increasingly difficult to hide. Inside the estate, the atmosphere was anything but restful. Medical staff were working around the clock, and senior members of the royal family were in constant communication about the king's declining condition. It was during this tense period that Princess Anne decided to have a frank conversation with her brother. She found Charles sitting alone in a small reading room, holding the letter their mother had written before her death. Without any preamble or softening of her words, Anne told him directly that he could not continue to hide the truth from the family or from the nation. Charles did not respond immediately. He sat in silence for a long moment, still holding the letter. Then he looked up at his sister and said something that revealed exactly what was weighing on his mind. He told her that it was not the truth itself that frightened him, but rather what that truth would leave behind for his family and for the institution he had spent his entire life preparing to lead. Anne understood at that moment that her brother was not resisting the inevitable out of stubbornness or denial. He was trying to shield everyone else from the pain and disruption that his declining health would cause. By the second week of October, the situation had become impossible to manage quietly. King Charles had missed 4 scheduled engagements in a row, and there was simply no way to explain away such absences without raising serious questions. Prince William had become a daily presence at Sandringham, and he began taking over responsibilities that would normally have been handled exclusively by the reigning monarch. The public and the press began to notice this shift. Journalists started using the term acting sovereign when referring to William, an unofficial title that nonetheless carried significant constitutional weight. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, also stepped up during this period, taking on ceremonial duties with her characteristic grace and composure. However, those who knew her well could see the tension in her posture and the careful way she chose her words during public appearances. It was the bearing of someone who was preparing for a change that nobody had asked for, but that seemed increasingly unavoidable. Then came the phone call that would change everything. At 24 minutes past 3 in the morning, Prince William's secure telephone line rang. These calls are reserved for only the most urgent matters of state or family emergency. And William knew before answering that the news would not be good. The senior advisor on the other end of the line spoke just 7 words that carried enormous implications. His Majesty has lost full cognitive clarity. This was not a report of the king's death, but in many ways it represented something almost as significant from a constitutional perspective. During an episode brought on by a combination of medication and exhaustion, King Charles had reportedly experienced severe confusion. In one particularly heartbreaking moment, he looked at Princess Anne and asked whether their mother was still waiting for her coronation. The confusion was deeply distressing for everyone present, but beyond the emotional impact, it raised a fundamental question about governance. A monarch who could no longer reliably distinguish between past and present, who could no longer maintain the mental clarity required for the role, was facing a situation that the British Constitution had rarely contemplated in the modern era. The palace response was swift and decisive. Medical documentation was immediately reviewed by the king's physicians and by independent consultants brought in to provide objective assessments. Constitutional lawyers were quietly consulted about the legal mechanisms available in such unprecedented circumstances. And then, the sealed letter that Charles had written months earlier, the document that had been stored in Sandringham's private vault, was finally brought out and opened. Inside that envelope was a single page of instructions, handwritten by the king himself. Multiple sources have confirmed that the document contained clear guidance for what should happen in the event that he lost cognitive capacity. It specified that interim authority should be transferred to the Prince of Wales, with full advisory rights granted to Princess Anne. This was not a will in the traditional sense, nor was it a formal abdication. It was something entirely new in modern royal history. A sitting monarch making the deliberate choice to step aside not because of death, but because of a commitment to duty and to the proper functioning of the crown. By dawn, the machinery of transition had already begun moving. Sandringham was placed under enhanced security protocols, with access restricted to only essential personnel and family members. A royal helicopter was dispatched to Windsor, though the palace did not specify its purpose. And Queen Camilla, who had been at her husband's side throughout his illness, quietly left the estate. According to her press secretary, she had departed for Florence to have some time for personal reflection. The truth, however, was more complicated. Camilla had spent weeks arguing against the opening of that letter, believing that Charles would recover sufficiently to continue his reign. When that hope faded and the decision was made to proceed with the transfer of authority, she chose to step away from the immediate situation. As the British public woke up to headlines announcing that Prince William had assumed interim powers, a far more complex operation was taking shape behind palace walls. The term that journalists were using, soft succession, had never been part of official royal vocabulary before. This was not a coronation, nor was it an abdication in the traditional sense. Instead, it represented something unprecedented in modern British history, a living monarch stepping back from active duty while still technically holding the crown. Inside Sandringham, the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. Prince William, who had spent his entire adult life preparing for the role of king, while hoping it would not come too soon, now found himself carrying the weight of the monarchy without any of the ceremony that usually accompanies such a transition. Those who saw him during these first days described a man who appeared physically exhausted. He wore the same navy suit day after day, his ties slightly loosened, his eyes showing the strain of sleepless nights spent grappling with decisions that would shape the future of the institution his family has served for generations. Princess Anne became his closest advisor during this period. Together, they formed what some observers were calling a dual regency, though no such official title existed in constitutional terms. Anne, with her decades of experience and her deep understanding of royal protocol, handled the intricate details of liaising with the Privy Council and the Church of England. Meanwhile, William focused on the public-facing aspects of leadership, working to maintain stability and reassure a nation that was understandably anxious about what was happening to their monarchy. Catherine stepped into a role that echoed the work of Queen Elizabeth during the difficult years of World War II. She visited hospitals, met with charity workers, and spent time with military veterans. Her presence provided a sense of continuity and comfort that the nation desperately needed. People saw in her the same quiet strength that had characterized the late Queen during times of national crisis. And her approval ratings climbed even higher as she navigated these difficult circumstances with grace. However, not everything was running smoothly behind the scenes. Queen Camilla's departure from Sandringham had left more than just a physical absence. It had created a genuine rift within the family and raised questions about her role in the monarchy going forward. Multiple sources confirmed that she had strongly opposed the opening of King Charles's sealed letter. She believed her husband would recover sufficiently to resume his full duties, and she had apparently hoped to play a more central role in managing the transition if one became necessary. When her counsel was ultimately set aside by Anne and William, and when the decision was made to proceed with the transfer of interim authority, Camilla made the choice to leave. Her communications team went silent for several days, and even her long-trusted lady-in-waiting quietly resigned, reportedly citing personal discomfort with the direction events were taking. Staff at Windsor whispered about what some described as a failed attempt by Camilla to position herself as a more dominant figure during the king's incapacity. Whether those whispers reflected reality or simply the tensions of an extraordinarily difficult time remains unclear. But what was certain was that Camilla's absence from the transition process was noticed and discussed throughout the royal household and in the press. Then came another significant revelation. A second letter emerged from the royal archives at Windsor, this one written by Queen Elizabeth herself. The letter had been sealed with specific instructions that it should only be opened if her son became incapable of leading while still alive. The existence of this letter had been known to only a handful of people, and its contents provided both moral authority and practical guidance for the decisions being made. The late Queen had written, among other things, that the crown is not kept by holding on, but by knowing when to hand it over. She emphasized that if continuity should falter, grace must prevail. The revelation of this letter had an immediate impact on public opinion. Seeing Queen Elizabeth's own handwriting, knowing that she had anticipated this possibility and had provided guidance for it, helped many people accept that what was happening was not a crisis or a coup, but rather a carefully considered transition that respected both the institution and the individual. The letter was reproduced on front pages across the country, and its message resonated deeply with a population that was trying to make sense of an unprecedented situation. International reaction began pouring in from around the world. The White House issued a formal statement expressing respect for King Charles's courage and admiration for Prince William's sense of duty. The Pope sent personal blessings to the family. In Commonwealth nations like Canada and Australia, the news sparked renewed debates about constitutional independence, not out of hostility toward the monarchy, but out of recognition that a new chapter was being written in the relationship between the Crown and the countries it represents. Back in Britain, Parliament convened a rare Sunday session to discuss constitutional contingencies during what they termed a period of royal medical suspension. While the session was largely symbolic, it sent an important signal that government institutions were aligning themselves with the new reality and supporting Prince William as he assumed interim authority. Some members of the old establishment, particularly courtiers who had served under Queen Elizabeth for decades, expressed private concerns about the pace of change. One told a journalist anonymously that the palace had always prepared for a sovereign's death, not for their decline, and that navigating this new territory felt uncomfortable and uncertain. Despite these reservations among some traditional voices, the British public responded with remarkable empathy and understanding. A poll conducted in the days following the announcement showed that over 70% of respondents agreed that William assuming interim authority was the right and respectful choice under the circumstances. People seemed to appreciate that the family was being honest about the situation, rather than maintaining a fiction that the king was fully capable, when clearly he was not. Inside Sandringham, King Charles remained under medical care. His condition was described as stable but fragile, and his moments of lucidity became less frequent and more brief. During his clearer moments, staff reported that he continued to ask for updates about how the public was responding to the news. In one particularly poignant exchange, he asked his physician whether people were angry with him for stepping back. The doctor reportedly replied that no, the nation was not angry. They were proud of him for making such a difficult decision with dignity. One final symbolic gesture captured the nature of this transition. The imperial state crown, the actual physical crown used during coronations and kept under heavy security at the Tower of London, was quietly moved to Windsor Castle. The official explanation was that it needed cleaning and preservation work, but the symbolism was unmistakable. The crown was not on display for tourists. It was not resting on the head of a king. It was waiting, held in trust, ready for whatever the future would bring, but not being rushed into service prematurely.